quiet weather station. Episode 3. The Wind Vane, Above the Valley. By the time the pale light had settled evenly over the valley, Elias Rowe had finished the indoor readings and carried his gray enamel mug into the station yard. He was in his late 40s, deliberate in his movements without being stiff, and the day's work sat comfortably on him. His slate wool waistcoat lay smooth over a cream work shirt, and his brown leather boots made a muted sound on the packed earth. He set the mug on the broad stone beside the door, where it could not be knocked by a passing sleeve, then stood with both hands free. Above the low roof, the wind vane showed as a darkened line of brass against the pearl-colored sky. Its arrow pointed somewhere between the worn direction cards, almost still. Elias did not decide from that first glance what needed doing. He watched the tail, the cups, and the upright spindle separately, letting each part declare its own condition. A cup shifted less than the width of his thumb and stopped. The arrow answered a moment later, then eased back. That small difference told him the valley air was present, though the instrument was not receiving it as freely as it should. He crossed to the center of the yard, choosing the square of level ground from which the whole platform could be seen without leaning or craning. The tower was modest, joined to the station wall, with its stair completely enclosed and its roof platform guarded by a firm rail. From below, Elias traced the rail with his eyes from one upright to the next. No joint stood proud, no board had shifted, and the access door remained seated squarely in its frame. He raised one hand to shade the last brightness, and looked at the vane again. The brass arrow had lost the clean edge it usually showed at this hour. A soft film of dust dulled the feathered tail, while the cups held little crescents of shadow along their rims. The 4 direction cards beneath them had faded unevenly. South could still be read from the yard. East became clear only when the light struck across it. North and west were pale enough to merge with the weathered supports. Elias lowered his hand. The task was not an emergency and required no haste, but it was now specific. Clean the moving assembly, check its bearing, and restore 4 readable references. Before fetching a tool, he inspected the ground around the tower. He began at the station door and walked clockwise, keeping one palm lightly against the stone wall. Dry cedar scales from the eaves had gathered in one shallow drift, and several leaves rested at the foot of the enclosed stair. He picked up the leaves in 2 quiet handfuls and placed them in the yard basket. The stone sill below the stair door was clear, with no grit pressed into its corners. Elias brushed it once with the side of his hand, then examined the lower hinges and the narrow rain strip. Both hinges sat straight. The strip was dry and unbroken. At the far side, he paused beneath the platform and looked along the underside of the boards, checking the dark lines where timber met timber. Evening light passed through no unexpected gap. The support brackets were firm, their bolts seated evenly, and the drain channel held nothing more than a few cedar needles. He drew those out with his fingers. When he completed the circuit, the base of the tower was orderly, and he had confirmed that the safe way upward needed only its customary check from within. Elias returned to the yardstone and took one measured drink from the gray enamel mug. The tea had cooled enough to carry the faint mineral taste of the station water, and the warmth left his hands relax when he set the mug down again. He used that pause to observe the vane from another angle. The valley opened beyond the station in long fields divided by hedges, all of them resting under mild evening air. Nearer grasses bent only at their tips. Farther away, a narrow line of poplars showed a slow change of color as their leaves turned. The wind reached those markers before it reached the yard. Gave Elias a useful comparison. He followed the movement toward the hill and then lifted his gaze to the cups. They should have begun an easy rotation. Instead, they rocked through part of a turn and returned. The arrow moved more willingly, yet its change of direction carried a slight pause at the same place each time. Elias held the 2 observations together without forcing a conclusion. Dust might burden the cups, old oil might slow the bearing, a simple strand of grass might be enough to interrupt both. Leaning would reveal which explanation belonged to the instrument. At the tower wall, a narrow inspection panel allowed the stair latches to be checked from the yard. Elias unlocked it with the small brass key he carried in his waistcoat pocket. The key turned smoothly, and the little door folded down into his palm. Inside, the lower latch bar stood fully home. The indicator strip beside it showed a clean band of white, meaning the roof access door above was closed. Elias pressed the test lever once. The bar moved its short intended distance and returned under steady spring pressure. He did not oil it merely because he had oiling to do elsewhere. This mechanism was clean and required no attention. He closed the panel, turned the key back, and tugged the edge gently to confirm the catch. Then he slipped the key into the same pocket, buttoning the flap over it. The act completed the outside safety check and also fixed the order of work in his mind. The roof door would remain closed while he prepared below. Tools would travel in the cedar case, nothing loose in his hands. Once on the platform, the case would be secured to the work rail before he touched the vane. He stepped inside the station and brought the brass lamp from the reading desk to the window table. Its flame was not yet needed for brightness, but its warm circle made small marks on paper easier to distinguish from old stains. Beside it, he laid the blue ledger, opened the clasp, and turned to the wind pages. The most recent entry described a mild southerly air during the morning round. The line below remained blank for evening. Elias ran a fingertip along the margin rather than across the writing, comparing the recorded direction with what he had just seen. South was still the likely source, though the arrow's reluctance made a formal observation premature. He checked the maintenance column. The vane had received routine cleaning at the beginning of the season, and its bearing had been oiled at the same time. Nothing unusual had been noted. That absence was useful. It meant he could approach the surface as ordinary care, preserving every part that remained sound. He placed the linen marker at the open page, closed the ledger against dust, and left it beside the lamp for the final entry after the instrument had answered freely. From a shallow drawer below the table, Elias removed the station diagram and unfolded it along its established creases. The drawing showed the vane from above and from the yard, with the 4 direction cards fitted to a crosspiece beneath the arrow. He carried it to the window and aligned the yard view with the instrument outside. The faded cards had not loosened or turned. Each remained in its proper place. North faced the cedar ridge beyond the station. East faced the first long field. South opened over the valley floor, and west met the descending line of the hill. Elias noted the screw heads indicated on the diagram and the small hidden locating notch on the north card. The other cards used different hole spacing, a quiet safeguard against mistaken placement. He refolded the sheet, giving each grease time to settle flat, and returned it to the drawer. The comparison had changed no plan, but it had removed the need to improvise aloft. He would take off one old card only when its replacement was ready, beginning at north, and moving in order through east, south, and west. Outside once more he stood near the enclosed stair door and listened. The station offered the small sounds of a building settling into evening, a timbered tick near the eave, the dry whisper of grass along the foundation, and the softest tap as one vane cup moved against the resistance above. Elias looked up at that tap. The cups traveled perhaps a quarter turn, enough for the nearest cup to show its inner surface. Along the spindle, just below it, something fine caught the light and vanished. He changed his position by 2 steps and waited for the brightness to return. When the cup shifted again, a pale fiber appeared briefly against the brass. It might be dried grass, or merely a line of dust seen edgeways. Either would be removed by the same careful cleaning, so he resisted reaching for a more dramatic explanation. Instead, he marked the location in practical terms. Outer cup assembly, lower side of the spindle, visible from the yard when facing west. That precise memory would guide his first, close inspection once the case was attached and the cloth laid out. Elias made a final circuit, this time attending to what his work might disturb. The gray enamel mug remained safely on the yard stone. The station window behind the work table was latched open by one notch, enough to carry fresh air without lifting the ledger pages. The yard basket stood away from the stair entrance, and the path between door and tower contained no loose object. He tested the stair door itself with one hand, its handle lowered cleanly, but he did not open it yet. First he looked above, confirming that no bird rested on the rail, and no loose twig lay across the platform boards. The platform was empty. Its rail enclosed the work area on every side, and the roof door opened inward onto a clear landing. Satisfied, he released the handle and let the latch settle. This second inspection was not a repetition of the first. The first had established the structure's condition. This one prepared the route for carrying the cedar case. With each small obstruction removed and each closure known, the climb could remain as uneventful as crossing the station room. The valley air reached the yard in a mild pulse and cooled the back of Elias's hand. Above him, the arrow moved toward south, paused at the same reluctant point, and settled just short of it. The cups rocked, and the pale fiber flashed once more. Elias now had enough information. Carried it indoors and placed it on its cork ring beside the sink, and place it on its cork. Then he washed his hands, dried them thoroughly, and rolled his cream shirt cuffs to the same height below each elbow. The slate waistcoat stayed buttoned so no loose edge could brush the instrument. The brown leather boots were already clean at the soles from his circuit on the dry ground. He touched the small brass key through the pocket flap, confirming it was secure, and turned toward the cabinet that held the cedar instrument case. Nothing had been opened prematurely, and no decision remained vague. The Vane needed ordinary, finite attention. Outside, it waited in quiet air. Inside, Elias was ready to bring every required item to it in one contained journey. The cedar instrument case occupied the middle shelf of a narrow cabinet, its handle facing outward, and its corners clear of the door. Elias opened the cabinet, lifted the case with both hands, and carried it to the table beneath the brass lamp. The cedar had darkened where years of fingers met the handle, while the broad panels retained a dry, clean fragrance. He set it down without sliding it across the wood. Before releasing the handle, he checked that the case stood level and that the blue ledger lay beyond the reach of its lid. Two brass catches held the front. Elias pressed each one with his thumb, listening for the modest click that meant the spring had cleared. The left catch opened first, then the right, preserving the habit that made it easy to notice if either resisted. Both moved freely. He raised the lid until its woven stays became taut and kept it there, while the cedar scent opened into the room. Nothing inside had shifted. The fitted compartments held their shapes exactly, and every tool remained separated from the bore of fresh direction cards. He began the inventory at the lid and worked downward. A soft brass brush rested beneath two linen loops, its bristles covered by a narrow paper sleeve. A clean linen cloth was folded into quarters beside it. Below them lay a short checking pin, a small screwdriver with a rounded wooden handle, and a narrow bottle of instrument oil sealed by a cork-lined cap. Elias lifted the bottle toward the lamp and turned it once. The oil was clear, with no cloud at the bottom. He tightened the cap lightly and returned it upright to its recess. In a covered tray, 4 new direction cards were separated by thin leaves of paper. Their painted letters were dark and matte, easy to read without glare. A spare paper strap and a maintenance pencil occupied the last channel. Elias touched each item as he named its purpose inwardly. The check was not ceremony. It ensured that nothing unnecessary traveled to the platform and nothing required would send him down midway through the service. He also examined the screwdriver tip beneath the lamp, turning the wooden handle until both edges showed. They were square rather than rounded, properly matched to the old card screws. The checking pin's marked insertion line remained dark and unbroken, so there would be no guess about its depth. Even the pencil had a firm point that could make a legible note without sharpening aloft. These were small assurances, but together they changed a collection of objects into a complete working set. When he reached the empty corner reserved for removed parts, he confirmed it was clean enough to receive the old cards. The linen cloth deserved its own inspection, because it would meet both brass and bearing. Elias unfolded it fully under the lamp. One half was plain, intended for wiping the arrow and cups. The other was divided by stitched lines into 4 small squares for old oil, final drying, clean handling, and any unexpected residue. The fabric carried no lint when he drew it gently between finger and thumb. He refolded it so the plain half would open first on the work shelf and the marked squares would remain protected underneath. Next, he removed the sleeve from the soft brush and bent the outermost bristles against his palm. They yielded without scratching. The brush had been cleaned after its last use, but he passed it over a white scrap of paper to be certain. Only a faint line of ordinary brass-colored dust appeared, not grit. He replaced the sleeve loosely so it could be removed with one hand on the platform. The cloth went back on top, the item he would need first after securing the case, and the brush followed beside it. Elias lifted the covered tray of direction cards and placed it on the clear portion of the table. He removed North alone, supporting its edge so the painted face did not touch the wood. Along the hidden lower side was the small locating notch shown in the station diagram. He held it toward the lamp, then turned the card to confirm that the letter would face outward when the notch met the frame. North returned to the first slot. East came next. Its two screw holes sat closer together than north's, and slightly above the center line. South used an even spacing across the middle, while west placed one hole higher than the other. Each difference was modest, almost invisible, when the cards were mounted, yet unambiguous in Elias's hands. He checked the painted faces at 2 angles beneath the brass lamp. Seen directly, each letter was dense and even. Seen from the side, none carried a raised bead that might hold water or cast a misleading stroke. The backs were bare, allowing timber to rest against timber, and their edges had been eased smooth. Elias passed a clean fingertip along each hidden edge, then compared the 4 card widths by standing them together on the paper leaf. Their tops aligned, confirming that the apparent differences belonged only to the locating features. He restored them to the tray in working order: north, east, south, west. Between them he returned the paper leaves, which protected the fresh paint and also made each card easy to lift without touching its face. The 4 replacements now formed a sequence rather than a loose collection. Beside the card, he laid the maintenance pencil and a small slip from the case. On it he wrote the date, the words "Vane cleaning and bearing check," and the order of the cards. The slip was not the final record. That belonged in the blue ledger after the work was tested. This note served only as a clean reminder aloft, where the fading light and open case should not require him to rely on memory for every detail. Elias drew 4 short blank lines beneath the card order. Each would receive a light mark when its replacement was firm. He made no mark yet. Then he returned the pencil and slipped to the lid pocket where they could be reached without crossing over the oil bottle. The arrangement separated clean work from oily work. Cards and paper stayed toward the lid. Brush and cloth occupied the middle, and bearing tools remained in the lower fitted bed. Elias lowered the tray into its recess and tested it with 1 fingertip. It did not rock. The case was ready to be carried without its contents tapping together. He checked the case's outer strap next. The leather had been fitted with a brass clip so the open case could be attached to the platform's work rail. Elias ran the strap through his hands from buckle to clip. Its edges were smooth, the stitching unbroken, and the buckle tongue sat in the marked hole. He opened the clip, pressed its gate twice, and watched it return completely each time. A little cedar dust had gathered where the strap passed beneath the case. He wiped it away with a separate cabinet cloth, not the clean linen reserved for the Vane. Then he lifted the loaded case by its handle, just far enough to feel the balance. The weight remained close to his leg, with no pull toward the oil bottle or the card tray. He set it down and folded the outer strap across the lid in its carrying position. On the platform it would be the first thing he released, and the first thing he secured. Until then, both hands could remain on the case whenever the stair changed direction. The brass lamp cast a steady oval over the table as Elias brought the blue ledger near without opening it. He compared the case inventory card, tucked beneath the lid lining, with the tools he had just examined. Every listed item was present, and no extra tool had found its way into an empty recess. He closed the lid slowly enough for the woven stays to fall inward rather than catch at the sides. Right breast catch fastened first this time, then the left, so he could test the pair as a single closure. He lifted the handle and gave the case 1 restrained tilt toward himself. Nothing slid. The oil bottle remained upright. The direction cards made no sound. Elias placed the case on the floor beside his right boot and turned down the brass lamp until the flame became small but steady. It would remain lit on the table, safely away from paper edges, giving the station a warm point to return to after the service. The ledger stayed closed beside it, its linen marker holding the evening page. At the enclosed stair door, Elias set the cedar case on the stone threshold and removed the small brass key from his waistcoat coat. He checked the stair indicator through the wall panel once more, then inserted the key in the door lock. A quarter turn released the lower latch. He opened the door inward and let the cooler air of the stairwell meet him. The staircase rose inside solid walls, turning at broad landings. A handrail followed both sides, and small glazed windows admitted the remaining daylight. Elias looked along the first flight. The treads were dry, their edges clearly marked, and nothing stood on the landing. He switched on the shielded stairlight, not because the way was dark, but because its even glow removed the deepening shadows beneath each tread. With the route visible from foot to landing, he returned the key to his pocket and secured the flap. Only then did he lift the case. He carried it at his side, leaving his other hand free for the rail. He climbed at an unhurried working pace, placing each brown leather boot fully on the center of a tread before raising the other. At the first landing, he set the cedar case on the built-in bench and looked through the window while his breathing remained easy. The yard below appeared orderly, mud gone, blasted aside, path clear. Beyond it, the valley fields stretched wider than they had from ground level. The poplar leaves continued their slow silvering, showing that the mild air had not ceased. While the case rested, Elias checked its 2 catches by touch and felt the strap lying flat across the lid. Neither had changed during the first flight. He turned the handle outward before lifting again, preventing the case from brushing the wall at the stair's bend. Elias changed the case to his other hand and began the next flight. At the second landing he repeated the pause, using the bench rather than holding the weight unnecessarily. Through this window the Vane's lower crosspiece came into view, and the faded west card could be seen edge on. It did not wobble. A narrow window latch stood fully seated. He pressed it once and heard no rattle from the glass. But the enclosed stair kept every step sheltered, and the rail remained beneath his free palm throughout the turn. By dividing the climb into its ordinary sections, he arrived at the upper landing, neither hurried nor burdened. The roof access door stood directly before him, its latch at waist height and its inward swing marked on the floor. Elias placed the cedar case on the upper bench, checked that the landing behind him was clear, and took out the small brass key. It entered the lock without pressure. He turned it, lifted the latch, and opened the door only a hand's breadth at first. Mild air passed through, carrying the dry scent of timber in distant fields. Nothing pressed against the door. He opened it fully until the retaining hook met its eye, then tested the hook with a gentle pull. The roof platform lay level beyond the sill, completely enclosed by its rail. Elias stepped across with one hand on the fixed grab bar, turned, and brought the cedar case through after him. He placed it on the work shelf, closed the access door, and latched it from the platform side so it could not move while he worked. Finally he unfolded the outer strap, clipped it around the work rail, and pressed the gate closed. The case was secure. Only now did he open its 2 catches beneath the quiet Vane. On the railed platform, Elias first gave the evening air a moment to pass around him without beginning. It was cooler than the yard, but mild, and it moved his cream shirt only where the sleeves were rolled. The access door sat latched behind him. The cedar case was clipped to the work rail at 2 points, the leather strap and the case's fitted brass hook, so its open lid could not shift. He pressed each attachment once, then raised the lid and let the woven stays take its weight. From the top recess he removed the clean linen cloth. He spread the plain half across the work shelf, smoothing it from the center toward each corner, and tucked its near edge beneath the shelf lip. The cloth created a pale field on which a screw, fiber, or drop of old oil would be visible immediately. He ran one fingertip beneath the tucked edge, confirming that no splinter or raised nail could catch the linen when it was folded. At the shelf's far end, a shallow wooden rim formed a second boundary against rolling parts. Elias left that strip bare, easy to inspect throughout the work. The soft brush went along the cloth's left edge, still in its paper sleeve. On the right, he placed the maintenance slip and pencil, protected by the case lid. Every other item remained fitted inside. The arrangement kept his movements short. Cleaning tools nearest the Vane, written note under shelter, closed compartments behind both. With the surface arranged, Elias looked closely at the brass assembly for the first time. The arrow was longer than it appeared from the yard. Its pointed head extended over the south side of the crosspiece, while the feathered tail balanced it above north. Elias did not touch it at once. He followed the brass from tip to tail, noting where the weather film lay thickest. Dust had gathered behind the small seams of the feathering and along the underside of the shaft. The upper surfaces were cleaner, washed by ordinary rain and dried by the valley air. No seam had opened, the arrowhead remained straight, and the tiny balanced collar beside the spindle showed no sign of movement. Beneath it, the cup assembly carried a similar dulling, with a darker band around each hollow. Elias moved to the other side of the central post, keeping within the clear workspace enclosed by the rail. There he found the pale fiber he had glimpsed below. A single dry grass thread looped loosely around the lower cup spindle. It was not tight enough to bend anything, but one end brushed the hub whenever the cups tried to turn. The cause of their rocking was now visible and entirely simple. He began with the arrowhead because it offered a clean direction for the work. Removing the paper sleeve from the soft brass brush, he held the sleeve under the point to catch whatever fell. Short strokes lifted dust from the upper ridge, each stroke traveling away from the central bearing. The dust came free as a fine tan veil and settled on the sleeve. Elias turned the arrow gently by its balanced collar, never by the point, and brushed the lower ridge in the same way. A narrow line of brass emerged, not bright or newly polished, but warm and even. That was the finish he wanted. The Vane had earned the softened color of use. Cleaning meant freeing its movement and making its surfaces legible, not erasing its age. He laid the brush down, folded one clean corner of the linen cloth over 2 fingers, and wiped from the base of the arrowhead toward the tip. The cloth gathered the loosened dust. A final pass left no streak, and the point carried the evening light in one quiet line. And as Elias attended to the shaft, he steadied it beside the balance collar and drew the brush along the shallow groove on its upper side. The groove held finer dust than the arrowhead, mixed with a few grains of pale pollen. He worked along half the shaft, shifted his supporting hand to the cleaned portion, and completed the other half without crossing the central bearing. Then he cleaned the underside, where the film was heavier. Rather than force the brush into the narrow place near the hub, he folded the linen cloth into a slim edge and passed it through once, drawing the dust outward. The shaft's roundness became clearer beneath his fingers. He checked it by sight from the arrowhead toward the feathered tail. No bend interrupted the line. At the balance collar, he found a small, dark mark left by old handling. 2 gentle turns of the cloth removed it. Elias rotated the arrow through a quarter circle and repeated his sighting. The clean shaft now showed a consistent honey-colored tone, and its balance point remained centered over the upright spindle. The feathered tail required patience because its narrow brass veins overlapped. Elias supported the solid base with his left hand and used the brush in his right, working from the innermost seam outward. Each channel released a different little gathering: ordinary dust in the upper 2, a trace of cedar pollen in the middle, and one soft fragment of a dry leaf at the lowest edge. He placed the leaf fragment on the linen cloth, rather than allowing it to blow across the platform. Between the veins, the brass had stayed darker, producing a gentle contrast when the exposed surfaces became clean. Elias wiped each vein separately, folding the cloth to a fresh area before moving to the next. He checked the thin edges with the pad of his thumb. They were smooth, with no burr to catch the air or the fabric. When the tail was finished, he released it and watched the arrow seek its resting direction. It moved a little farther than before, then paused. The cups and bearings still waited for attention, but the clean tail had already reduced one source of drag. Elias turned to the first cup, the one nearest the south card. Holding its supporting arm close to the hub, he brushed the outer curve from rim to base. Dust slid toward the linen, rather than into the hollow. He cleaned the rim with one slow circuit of folded cloth, then wiped the inside from its deepest point outward. The hollow held a faint gray bloom that darkened the fabric, but concealed no damage. When it was gone, the cup's shape read clearly in the low light, a smooth bowl made to receive the slightest moving air. Elias tested the joint between cup and arm with the lightest pressure. It remained firm. He did not spin the assembly yet, because the grass thread still crossed the lower spindle and the remaining cups carried their weather film. Instead, he turned the hub only enough to bring the second cup into the same working position. The first traveled away cleanly, offering no scrape. Its newly even surface caught the last pale reflection from the valley and held it for a moment. The second and third cups showed different evidence of their exposure. In the second, a thin crescent of pollen had settled just below the rim. Elias loosened it with the brush and caught it on a folded corner of linen. The third held 2 tiny cedar scales, light enough to have ridden the air upward and sheltered where the bowl curved inward. He lifted them with the end of the brush rather than rubbing them across the brass. Each cup was then wiped inside and out. Its rim followed completely, its fastening checked at the arm. Elias kept the sequence by moving clockwise around the hub and returning every used fold of cloth toward his palm. That prevented a dusty surface from beating clean metal. As the third cup came clear, the assembly's balance became easier to feel through the supporting arm. It no longer tried to return to the same heavy side. He rotated the hub just enough to place the fourth cup before him. This was the cup associated with the grass thread, and he left its lower spindle untouched until its bowl and ream were clean. The fourth cup bore no extra dirt beyond the ordinary film, yet the pale grass thread made its movement incomplete. Elias cleaned the bowl first, giving himself a clear surface to support. Then he placed the soft brush aside and examined the thread from both sides of the hub. It had formed one loose loop and a half turn, with its broken end lying against the spindle. He pinched that free end between the clean edges of the linen cloth. Pulling would have tightened the loop, so he moved the end backward around the spindle, following the way it had arrived. The first half turn opened. He paused with the loop slack, checking that it had not passed beneath a washer or caught around the arm. Its path remained entirely visible. He guided the cup assembly a few degrees with his other hand, and the remaining loop rose without resistance. The entire thread came away intact, no longer than his finger. Elias laid it beside the leaf fragment on the cloth and straightened it with the brush tip. Both broken ends were present, showing that no small piece had been left behind. He inspected the spindle where it had rested, first in the direct evening light, and then against the pale cloth held beyond it. The brass was unmarked, and no fiber remained in the narrow seam. What had seemed from the yard like a reluctant mechanism had been, in part, one dry strand occupying exactly the wrong place. With all 4 cups clean and the thread removed, Elias held the hub lightly and turned the assembly through one complete revolution by hand. The first cup passed the central post, then the second, third, and fourth, each maintaining the same distance. He felt no tick through his fingertips. On a second revolution he used less pressure, allowing the cups to carry themselves past the balance point. They traveled farther and stopped without returning to a preferred side. Elias marked the resting cup with his eye, waited, and began a third turn from the opposite arm. This time, a different cup finished lowest. Useful confirmation that no remaining weight of dust was choosing the stopping place. He viewed the revolving rims against the straight top of the rail. Their path described one even circle, rather than rising and falling. Elias listened close enough to distinguish the linen edge stirring in the air from the mechanism itself. The hub made no scrape. He checked each arm along its length and wiped the narrow upper surfaces that had been hidden during the first cleaning. Then he removed the 2 cedar scales, leaf fragment and grass thread from the work cloth, and placed them in a small waste envelope kept in the case. Before sealing it, he folded the envelope once around the grass thread so it could not slip back through the opening in a gust. The evidence of the cleaning was contained, not left to revisit the instrument. When he released the cups, a mild breath moved them through almost half a turn before fading. Elias used the final clean fold of the plain cloth for a single finishing pass over arrow, tail, arms, and cup rims. He did not polish. He removed fingerprints left by necessary support and ensured that no brush bristle had caught at a seam. The restored brass held several shades: gold where the cloth had passed, deeper brown in protected joints, and a dim amber along the tail. But the tones belonged together. He returned the soft brush to its paper sleeve and laid it in the case's used sewell side. On the maintenance slip he made a brief note: dry grass thread remove intact, cups free by hand. The sentence captured the cause and the result without overstating either. He then folded the dusty half of the linen inward, exposing the stitched squares reserved for bearing work. Above the platform, the clean arrow responded to another faint change in air and moved toward south. It still paused slightly near the same point. Surface drag had been resolved. The remaining hesitation now belonged to the bearing check, exactly the next task prepared in the cedar case. The checking pin lay in its fitted recess below the oil bottle, a short length of smooth brass with a flattened end made for the Vane's service collar. Elias lifted it out and wiped it with the square of linen marked for clean handling. Then he opened the little cover beneath the central hub. The cover swung aside on a captive hinge and revealed the service collar, without exposing the bearing to the open air. Elias inspected the opening before inserting anything. The old oil had formed a narrow dark ring at the lower seat, and a few grains of dust rested on the outer lip. None had passed inward. He brushed those grains away from the opening, returned the brush to its sleeve, and aligned the flat of the checking pen with the collar slot. It entered only to its marked line. Elias applied upward pressure with 2 fingers, enough to take the arrow's weight from the bearing, while leaving the assembly seated on its post. The Vane rose by scarcely a visible amount. The safe, railed platform remained still beneath him, and the instrument was now supported for cleaning. Keeping the checking pin steady, Elias used the stitched square reserved for old oil. He folded it into a firm point and touched the dark ring at the seat. Oil transferred to the linen in a thin amber-gray curve. He turned the cloth and touched the opposite side, lifting the remainder rather than spreading it. The old lubricant was neither gummy nor dry, it had simply lightest movement. Elias repeated the contact with a fresh edge until the linen came away nearly clear. Between contacts, he watched the checking pin's insertion mark. It stayed level with the collar, confirming that the slight lifted weight had not changed while his attention moved to the cloth. His supporting wrist rested against the fixed post, a stable position that required no strain. He did not push fabric into the bearing or disturb the polished inner surface. The service design allowed the seat to be cleaned from outside while the weight remained relieved. When the visible ring was gone, he held the used square toward the evening light, spreading it flat enough to read the residue from edge to edge. No bright shaving or dark metal grain appeared in it, only oil and dust. That absence confirmed what his fingers had suggested. The bearing was sound, not worn. He folded the marked square inward so it could touch nothing else, and placed that corner on the protected side of the work shelf. The narrow seat needed a dry finishing pass. Elias took the linen square marked for final drying, rolled one edge between his fingers, and followed the outer circle without entering the bearing. A faint line came away on the first pass. The second left the cloth unchanged. He examined the service collar, the underside of the balance collar, and the upright spindle. Their meeting lines were clean and concentric, with the checking pin still carrying the slight weight. He rotated the arrow by a few degrees. The relieved bearing moved without catching, which allowed him to see the entire seat in turn. No hidden pocket of old oil remained. He stopped with the arrow aligned over the south card, and held it there while the last trace of solvent-free dryness returned to the brass. Nothing more was required. Adding oil before the seat was clean would only preserve the dust he had removed. Continuing to wipe after the cloth stayed clear would serve no purpose. Elias set the drying square apart and reached for the oil bottle with his free hand. He lifted the bottle upright from the cedar case and checked its cap once more before opening it. The cap released with a small turn, bringing the glass dropper with it. Elias held the dropper over the bottle until the excess oil gathered back into the neck. One clear drop remained at the tip. He placed it on the near side of the bearing seat, where it rounded into a bright bead rather than running. A second drop went to the far side. Together they formed the measured amount specified by the station diagram. Enough to coat the seat when the weight returned. Not enough to travel down the post. Elias waited while the two beads settled into shallow arcs. He added no third drop. The bottle went straight back into its upright recess, and the cap was tightened before he shifted his attention. Under the mild evening light, the fresh oil was almost invisible, except for one clean reflection. The bearing had received precisely what it needed, and the cedar case remained free of any spill. Elias lowered the vane onto the bearing gradually. The checking pin descended between his fingers until the arrow's weight transferred from the service collar to the newly oiled seat. As contact returned, the two clear arcs spread around the circle and disappeared beneath the balance collar. No oil emerged below. Elias withdrew the pin along the same line by which it had entered, wiped its flattened end on the used oil square, then on the drying square, and inspected it. The brass surface remained smooth. He closed the captive service cover and pressed it until its tiny catch seated flush. The checking pin returned to the case only after its recess had been lined with the clean handling portion of the cloth, keeping any final trace separate from the other tools. Elias released the arrow. It stayed towards south because the air had quieted, yet the old hesitation could no longer be judged merely by waiting. He prepared to check the full circle by hand, using the balance collar as he had during cleaning. He guided the arrow eastward in a slow quarter turn and let go. It remained where placed, neither creeping back nor dipping at the tail. He moved it to north, released it, then to west and south. At every point, the arrow rested level. This first circuit checked balance rather than freedom, and the result was even. Elias lowered his gaze to the balance collar while the arrow rested at each quarter. The narrow gap beneath it kept the same width all around, showing that the weight sat centrally on the seat. No fresh oil appeared at the edge when the heavier tail passed over west. On the second circuit, Elias used only the side of one finger. The arrow traveled smoothly past each direction card, with no rough point transmitted through the collar. At the place where it had paused before service, it continued under the same light touch. Elias stopped it beyond that point, nubbed it back, and crossed again. The movement remained equal in both directions. For a final comparison, he started it with a touch no stronger than the one used at north, and watched it cover nearly the same short arc at south. He listened as well as felt. The spindle gave no click, and the seat no dry whisper. A clear bearing was almost silent, leaving only the soft passage of the tail through the air. When the arrow completed the circle, he withdrew his hand and allowed it to choose its own resting place. A shallow breath of valley air reached the platform while the arrow was still free from his touch. It first lifted the loose edge of Elias's rolled sleeve, then moved across the clean tail. The arrow turned several degrees towards south without the former pause. The motion was modest but continuous, a beginning, a gentle travel, and an easy stop when the air diminished. Elias waited for a second breath. During the still interval, he aligned the tip by sight with one narrow seam between valley fields. That gave him a fixed reference finer than the direction card alone. This one arrived from slightly east of the first, and the arrow answered by shifting back with the same ease. When the air faded, the tip returned near the field seam but did not spring past it. The new oil was supporting movement, not producing a drift of its own. He did not interpret the small variation as a new weather pattern. Evening currents often followed the contours of the fields before settling into the station's standard observation. What mattered now was the Vane's response. It no longer required enough force to rock the cups before turning. The clean surfaces received the air, and the oiled bearing allowed that information to pass into movement. Elias marked, bearing free through full circle, on the maintenance slip, and set the pencil down beneath the case lid. The cup assembly had its own central movement, so Elias checked it after the arrow. He placed one finger behind the nearest arm and gave it just enough pressure to begin. The 4 cups completed a slow revolution, then another half, losing speed evenly until they came to rest. Noak dropped abruptly at the bottom of its path. He repeated the start from a different arm. The result matched. The grass thread was gone, the rims were clean, and the hub made no sound against its spindle. When a mild current passed over the platform, it took over from his hand and carried the cups through one unassisted turn. Their motion remained calm enough that each bowl could still be followed by eye. Elias watched the space between hub and post. It stayed constant. There was no wobble to correct, no fastening to tighten. The cleaning had restored balance, and the bearing service had restored the arrow's lightness. Both moving systems now worked without asking for further adjustment. Before closing the bearing task, Elias inspected for consequences of his own work. He ran a clean fold of linen below the service cover. It came away dry, showing that no oil had escaped. He examined the platform cloth for a dropped screw or hidden tool. The checking pin was in its recess, the bottle stood capped, and the old oil square was folded inward. He closed the lower compartment of the cedar case over those items so the direction cards above could be handled without crossing the used materials. Then he wiped the balance collar once, removing the prints left during the circular test. The arrow moved while he withdrew the cloth, passing the south card and settling back toward it. Its path was so easy that the distinction between his final contact and the arriving air was plain. Elias let his hands rest on the work shelf. The practical center of the service was complete. What remained was not repair but renewal, replacing 4 faded references so the free movement could be read clearly from the yard. He gave the Vane one last bearing check without touching it. For the length of several quiet breaths, the air rose intermittently from the valley. The cups turned, slowed, and turned again. The arrow followed the changing current in small, unbroken arcs, sometimes leading the cups, sometimes waiting as the air crossed the platform unevenly. No point in the circle held it. Elias compared this motion with the reluctant quarter turns he had observed from below. The difference was visible without exaggeration. He closed the oil bottle compartment and drew the clean half of the linen cloth over it, leaving a fresh handling square exposed. The used brush, waste envelope, and bearing cloth stayed separated beneath the divider. Then he removed the covered tray of direction cards and placed it on the pale work surface. North waited on top, its hidden notch toward him. The instrument could now move as intended. The next careful actions would give that movement 4 clear names. Elias began at north as the station diagram prescribed. He rotated the arrow aside, giving his hands an unobstructed path to the card without changing the crosspiece. The old north letter was barely visible up close, its dark paint reduced to a few soft traces within the grain. Before loosening anything, he held the fresh card beside it and confirmed the outward face, upper edge, and hidden locating notch. Looking beyond the card, he matched north to the cedar ridge he had used from the yard. This independent line showed that the crosspiece itself had stayed true. Only the letter had lost clarity. The new card returned to the tray while he fitted the rounded screwdriver to the burst old screw. One hand supported the card, the other turned the screw a quarter turn at a time. After each turn, he shifted his supporting fingers closer to the loosening head, preventing the timber from hanging on the second fastening. It released without complaint. He placed it in the shallow brass cup built into the case lid, then removed the second screw in the same manner. The faded north card lifted straight from its locating edge. Beneath it, the mounting surface was clean except for a pale outline showing unhurried. North's reference had never shifted. Elias laid the retired card face up on a paper leaf so its orientation would remain evident for the maintenance record. With the north position open, he cleaned only what the replacement would cover. A narrow fold of linen removed the dust along the upper edge and around both screw holes. Elias avoided abrading the pale outline, which offered a useful guide to the original alignment. He lifted the fresh north card by its sides. The small notch met the matching rise on the frame before either screw entered, and the card settled flat within the old outline. Its dark letter faced the cedar ridge and could be read at once. Elias inserted the first screw with his fingers until the threads engaged, then did the same with the second. He alternated the screwdriver between them, one restrained turn on each side, bringing the card evenly toward the timber. When resistance became firm, he stopped. The card did not need pressure enough to mark its surface. He tested the lower corners with one fingertip. Neither moved. On the maintenance slip, he placed a light check beside north. The first new direction now stood clear, while the other three old cards still held the crosspiece's full reference. East came second. Elias moved around the central post within the railed platform and positioned the fresh east card on the linen before touching the mounted one. Its close-set holes and slightly raised centerline distinguished it from the others, even with the letter covered. He compared those holes to the two visible screw heads, then supported the faded card from below. The upper screw loosened first, followed by the lower. Each went into a separate section of the lid cup so it could be returned to its own position if inspection showed a difference. The old east card came free with a faint, dry release where its back had rested against the frame. Its letter retained more paint than north's, though the lower stroke had faded into the wood. Elias placed it after north on the second paper leaf, maintaining the clockwise order. The exposed mounting face showed no moisture stain and no crushed grain. A quick linen pass lifted dust from the two holes. He checked their threads visually. Both remained clean and ready to receive the original screws. The fresh east card aligned through its hole spacing before it touched the frame. Completely, Elias guided the upper screw in by hand, leaving it loose enough for the lower hole to find its natural position. The second screw entered without being drawn sideways. Only then did he tighten them in alternation, watching the card settle squarely against the old sheltered outline. The painted E remained upright and centered. When both screws were firm, he pressed once near each hole and once at the lower edge. The card stayed still. Elias stepped back to the center of the platform, not for a broad inspection yet, but to compare north and east across the crosspiece. Their upper edges formed a level relationship and the letters faced their separate landscapes without tilting toward the observer. The contrast was pleasingly practical. Dark matte paint against warm brass and weathered timber, legible without looking new for its own sake. He added the check beside east on the slip. Half the references were renewed, and the frame had never been left without at least 3 established directions. South followed, the direction toward which the evening arrow had repeatedly settled. Its old card remained the most readable from the yard, but its paint had thinned enough that replacing only the other 3 would have produced an uneven set. Elias held the fresh south card beside it. The holes were evenly spaced across the middle, unlike east's raised pair. He waited for a mild movement of air to carry the arrow away, then steadied the balance collar while he loosened the screws. The Vane required no force. One finger kept the clean tail from drifting back across his work. The old south card lifted from a frame surface, darkened slightly by its greater exposure to valley dust. Elias laid it third on the paper leaves, face up and aligned with north and east. On its back, a faint pencil S from the original fitting remained visible. He did not rub it away. That modest mark belonged to the card's service history and would be noted when the 4 retired pieces were strapped together. Elias wiped the south mounting face until the linen no longer gathered dust, then let the fresh card meet the frame. Both holes aligned at once. He started the left screw, then the right, keeping the pressure equal as the threads took hold. The cards settled within the sheltered outline with no exposed rim at either side. He tightened only until the screwdriver's wooden handle met the familiar resistance. A further turn might have been possible, but it would not have made the fitting safer or clearer. Elias released the arrow. It passed above the newly painted S, paused in the mild current, and moved back again, showing that the card stood clear of every moving part. He viewed north, east, and south in sequence. Each letter was distinct, each card was square, none drew the eye through excessive brightness. The third check went on to the maintenance slip. Only west remained, and because the other directions were now fixed, its position could be confirmed against 3 renewed references as well as its own old outline. At west, one screw sat slightly higher than the other. The deliberate spacing Elias had examined beneath the brass lamp. He placed the fresh west card near the mount and covered its letter with a paper leaf. Even without the W, the offset holes made its identity certain. He removed the lower screw from the old card and placed it in the lid cup, then supported the upper corner while releasing the higher screw. The faded card came away. Its outward face had lost almost all of the dark stroke on one side, explaining why it disappeared against the evening sky from the yard. Elias set it forth in the retired sequence. Behind it, the timber showed a narrow line of dust along the western edge, where the prevailing mild air had pressed particles inward. He drew that dust onto the linen with one outward motion, folded the cloth, and repeated until the edge was clear. Both screw holes retained their shape. The last open position was clean, correctly identified, and ready. With replacement could fit only in its intended orientation. Elias brought the higher hole to the upper screw position and felt the back settle into the old outline. He started the upper screw but left the card able to pivot by the width of a hair. The lower screw then found its thread without pressure. Alternating between them, Elias brought both heads down until they sat evenly against the card. The W remained upright. He tested the corners, checked clearance beneath the arrow, and placed the 4th mark on the slip. North, east, south, and west now completed the circle in order. Elias moved to the center of the platform and slowly turned his attention through all 4. He lowered his gaze until each card appeared against the rail, rather than the open landscape, a useful test at them paint under reduced contrast. Every letter stayed readable. Raising his gaze again, he compared the card tops with the level crosspiece. No replacement rose above its neighbor or leaned away from the post. North met the cedar ridge. East opened along the first field. South faced the valley floor. West followed the hill's descending line. The cards did not merely spell directions, their placement corresponded plainly to the land around the station. The restored references made the Vane's next movement readable before any entry was written. But he gathered the 4 old cards without changing their order. North went on the bottom of the paper stack, then east, south, and west, each separated by the leaf on which it had rested. Elias aligned their edges and wrapped the spare paper strap around the bundle. On the strap he wrote the date and the words, removed in serviceable order. Paint faded. He did not label them damaged, because the timber and holes remained sound. Their work outdoors was complete, and their preserved sequence could still show how the earlier lettering had weathered. Before closing the strap, he copied each locating feature onto its paper leaf. Notch for north, close high holes for east, even holes for south, offset holes for west. The written order could therefore be checked against the cards themselves without exposing their faint faces repeatedly. Elias folded the labeled end of the strap over the top, where it would be visible as soon as the maintenance tray opened. The 4 original screws had been returned to their respective positions, leaving the case lid cup empty. Elias swept it with a clean corner of linen to confirm that no small part remained. He also ran the screwdriver tip around the cup's shallow rim. It found only smooth brass, not a hidden screw resting edgeways. Retired bundle fitted into the reserved lower corner of the cedar case, separate from the oil bottle and used cloth. Once placed there, it could not slide beneath the fresh cards, now empty tray. The transition from old references to new was fully accounted for. Elias performed the final fastening check in the same order as the replacement. At north, the screwdriver met firm resistance without turning the head. He repeated that gentle contact at east, south, and west, touching each screw once and only once. No card shifted. He then rotated the arrow through a complete circle by the balance collar, watching its lower edge pass above every letter. Clearance remained equal. The cup arms also cleared the card tops throughout their turn. From each side of the platform he read the opposite direction, confirming that the dark paint remained visible against both valley and sky. At the maintenance slip, he joined the 4 checks with one horizontal line and wrote, "Cards aligned, clear through full movement." The pencil returned to its pocket. Elias folded the empty replacement tray and fitted it beneath the retired bundle. The work surface now held only the clean handling square and the closed slip. With the 4 directions renewed in their proper order, the Vane was ready for the valley's own gentle test. Elias did not summon a test with his hand now that the service was complete. He stood within the safe rail and allowed the instrument to receive whatever mild air the valley offered. At first, the platform was nearly still. The fresh direction cards held their dark letters beneath the softened brass, and the cups rested with one hollow facing south. Then movement became visible below. The poplar line turned pale along its tops. Field grasses leaned in a widening band, and the change traveled up the slope without haste. Elias felt it arrive as coolness along the open part of his forearms. The edge of his cream shirt sleeve stirred. A moment later, the nearest cup accepted the air and moved. The other 3 followed in one balanced circle. The arrow began from west of south, passed above the clear east-west line as it found the current, and came gently around. There was no pause at the former rough point. It settled toward the new south card, quivered by a degree, and held. He watched through 3 measured cycles of the cups. The first was carried by the arriving breeze and completed without slowing. The second east as the air thinned. The third became a half-turn and stopped with no backward rock. Above them, the arrow remained toward south, responding to tiny variations with motions small enough to show that the bearing was free. Elias compared the letter beneath it with the landscape beyond. South faced the valley floor from which the visible breeze had climbed. The instrument, the cards, and the fields agreed. He gave the observation enough time to be useful but did not prolong it in search of a more dramatic change. Mild southerly air was the evening fact. On the maintenance slip he wrote the direction, and the words responded freely under light breeze. He added the time from his pocket watch, closed the watch, and returned it to his waistcoat. The question raised from the yard, whether dust, fiber, or bearing caused the reluctance, had received its complete answer in ordinary materials and restored movement. Packing began with the items least likely to soil anything else. Elias placed the pencil and completed slip in the lid pocket. The retired direction cards, already strapped and labeled, remained in their reserved corner. He folded the clean handling square over the checking pin, settled both into the fitted recess, and closed its divider. The oil bottle stood capped and dry. He touched the cap once, then fastened its retaining loop. The soft brush, paper sleeve in place, returned beneath the linen loops. Finally he folded the cloth so the used oil square and dusty surfaces lay entirely inward. The compact bundle fitted in the washable tray, rather than beside the cards. Elias inspected the pale work shelf as each item disappeared. He counted the tool recesses by sight, not to prolong the task but to close it accurately. Brush secured, screwdriver seated, pin wrapped, oil upright, pencil pocketed. The 4 empty spaces in the card tray corresponded to the 4 letters now fixed around the Vane. The one occupied corner held the old set under its strap. No grass thread, leaf fragment, screw, or pencil shaving remained. The waste envelope held the light debris and was sealed. When the shelf was bare, he drew his palm just above it, using the last sidelight to reveal anything too fine to see directly. Nothing moved. The platform had been left as clean as he found it. Before closing the cedar case, Elias reviewed the instrument from point to support. The arrowhead was straight and evenly clean. The shaft and feathered tail carried no loose fiber. 4 cups sat firm on their arms and turned together. The service cover beneath the bearing was closed flush, with no oil below it. North, east, south, and west were secure, aligned, and clear. He pressed neither Vane nor card during this review. The earlier physical checks were sufficient. Instead, he used sight and the breeze. Another mild current advanced from the valley and gave the cups one slow revolution. The arrow shifted a few degrees east of south, followed the air back, and stopped over south again. That quiet answer completed the functional check. Elias lowered the case lid, guiding the woven stays inward. He fastened the left catch and then the right, lifted the handle slightly, and listened. No tool moved inside. The case was ready for descent, and the instrument required nothing further from him that evening. He unhooked the case's brass clip from the work rail but left the leather strap secured until the access door was ready. At the door, Elias checked the clear landing through its small glazed panel. The shielded stairlight still shone evenly. He released the platform latch with the small brass key, opened the door inward, and set its retaining hook. Returning to the case, he freed the leather strap, folded it across the lid, and carried the case to the threshold with both hands. He placed it on the upper bench before stepping inside. One hand on the fixed grab bar, he crossed the sill and turned to view the platform. The work shelf was empty. The rail enclosed the quiet Vane, and the new card stood clear beneath it. Elias brought the access door closed until the latch met without a slam. He turned the key, tested the handle, and checked the white indicator band beside the lock. The roof was fully secured. Only then did he lift the cedar case from the bench and begin down the enclosed stair. At each landing he repeated the safe rhythm of the ascent. He set the case on the built-in bench, changed hands, and looked through the window before continuing. From the upper window, the arrow could be seen traveling a short distance around the south card, while the cups turned above it. From the lower window, only the renewed west letter faced him, dark enough to read through the glass. Elias took that as a useful groundward check, rather than another task. His brown leather boots landed squarely on each dry tread. The handrail remained under his free palm, and the solid stair walls held the evening air to a cool, cedar-scented stillness. At the bottom he placed the case on the stone threshold, switched off the stairlight, and opened the yard door. The exterior latch closed behind him. He locked it with the small brass key and tested it once. The full route from platform to yard was now closed, and every key-operated point had returned to its ordinary state. In the yard, Elias paused beside the broad stone where the gray enamel mug had stood earlier. Looking up no longer required him to infer letters from faded shapes. West showed clearly on the near side. When he crossed the yard, north emerged against the cedar ridge. The cups made a slow turn in the mild air, their cleaned rims taking brief lines of evening light. The arrow rested towards south with no visible hesitation. Elias walked one clockwise circuit around the tower, checking the platform underside and access closures after the work just as he had checked them before it. No object had fallen. No mark appeared on the sill. The drain channel remained clear, and the inspection panel stayed locked. At the point where he had first glimpsed the pale grass fiber, he looked up once more. The lower spindle was clean. The simple cause had been removed, the bearing refreshed, and the 4 references restored without altering any sound part. He carried the cedar case indoors. The brass lamp still burned low and steady over the table. Elias set the cedar case beside it, clear of the blue ledger, and opened the catches one last time. He removed the maintenance slip, the strapped bundle of retired cards, the folded linen, and the sealed waste envelope. The oil bottle and tools remained in their fitted places. He wiped the checking pin with a fresh scabnet cloth, inspected it, and returned it bare to its recess. The used linen went into the station's covered washing tin. The waste envelope went into the dry refuse drawer. He placed the old cards in the maintenance tray, keeping their northeast-southwest order beneath the paper strap. They would remain with the ledger record, rather than return to the roof cabinet. After checking that every recess was clean and dry, Elias closed the cedar case. Both catches clicked home. He carried it to the narrow cabinet, set it on the middle shelf with the handle outward, and closed the cabinet door. At the table, he opened the blue ledger to the linen marker. The blank evening line waited beneath the morning's mild southerly entry. Elias dipped the station pen, removed the excess at the rim, and wrote the time first. He recorded mild air from the south, then noted the practical service in the maintenance column. Arrow and cups cleaned, dry grass thread removed from cup spindle, bearing seat cleaned and given 2 drops of oil, movement free through full circle, direction cards replaced north, east, south, west, roof access secured. He copied no more than the work required, but omitted nothing another careful reader would need. In the narrow results box, he added that the arrow had settled south under a light valley breeze, and that all 4 letters were readable from the yard. He drew no conclusion beyond the observed response. The morning and evening lines now made a quiet comparison. The direction had remained southerly, while the instrument's ability to show it had become clear again. The fresh ink shone briefly under the brass lamp. Elias compared the line with his maintenance slip, checking each action once. When the entries agreed, he blotted the page, allowed it to rest open until dry, and placed the strapped old cards in the labeled ledger tray. The record now joined observation, cause, action, and result in one completed account. Elias washed the gray enamel mug and set it upside down on the wooden draining rack. He lowered the brass lamp flame, unrolled his cream shirt hubs, and brushed one trace of cedar dust from his slate wool waistcoat. The small brass key returned to its hook inside the locked desk drawer, where the roof and stair keys were kept after the day's circuit. He closed the drawer, then returned to the ledger. The ink had dried to the same blue blab as the earlier entries. Elias removed the linen marker, closed the cover, and fastened the ledger's clasp. It went into its place on the reading shelf, spine aligned with the station log beside it. The completed maintenance slip followed the retired cards into their tray. Around him, the room had resumed its ordinary order. Lamp on the table, case in the cabinet, bug drying by the sink. Every loose material accounted for. The practical work had reached its natural end rather than merely stopping. Before leaving the station room, Elias opened the window by one additional notch and stood where he could see the Vane above the yard wall. Evening had softened the valley into long bands of gray-green and pale earth. A last mild breeze moved through the poplars, crossed the fields, and reached the station. The cleaned cups accepted it one after another, completing a slow, even turn. The brass arrow traveled a short arc and rested above the south card, whose dark letter remained clear in the falling light. Nothing clicked, dragged, or waited for another visit. Elias watched only until the cups eased to stillness. Then he latched the window at its night setting, turned the brass lamp down and out, and closed the station door behind him. The enclosed stair and roof platform were secure. The ledger was complete, and the cedar case was put away. Above the quiet weather station, 4 clear directions surrounded a Vane ready for whatever Renissa, Neft, Wedis, may